sıradaki konuşmacımız Dr. Kernan, İngiltere'de University College London'da Çevresel Değişimleri Araştırma Merkezi'nde araştırmacı olarak görev yapmaktadır ve çalışmalarını asitleşme, kirlilik ve iklim değişikliğinin tatlı su ekosistemleri üzerindeki etkileriyle bilimsel politikalar üzerine düşünmektedir. Şimdi kendisini konuşmasını istiyorum.
Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to introduce to you the Refresh project. I'm the coordinator of the Refresh project, and I'm going to use my presentation to introduce the project, tell you a little bit about the rationale behind the project, but mainly I'm going to focus on the way we have worked with stakeholders and the way we have communicated with and hope to continue communicating with stakeholders during the project. So you've already heard a little bit about the project. The project is about adaptive strategies to mitigate the impacts of climate change on European freshwater ecosystems. Why are we doing it? Well, we know the climate is changing and will continue to change. We know that land use is changing and will continue to change. The pollution, the amount of pollution deposited onto our freshwater environments will also change, and water resource demands will also change. So within that context, all these changes will have an impact on our freshwater ecosystems, on hydrology, on chemistry, and the ecology. And we need to include those potential changes in our management of freshwater. And that is the overriding rationale behind Refresh. We want to try and ensure that the means to include those changes in our management programs are supported by sound science. The need to adapt to future climate change and other global changes has, of course, been recognised. And in 2009, the European Commission White Paper set out a framework for climate change adaptation measures and policies to enable the member states to reduce the vulnerability to the effects of climate change. And within this white paper, there is a section on increasing the resilience of biodiversity, ecosystems and water within the main objectives. And secondly, this report by the Common Implementation Strategy Group, guidance document number 24, is a report on river basin management in a changing world. This too recognises the potential impacts of climate change on the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. And in that report, there are several key elements. Firstly, it highlights the ways in which climate change impacts can be integrated into the way we prepare for the next round of river basin management plan cycles. Secondly, it seeks to help European member states to show how climate change projections have been considered in assessing the pressures and the impacts and monitoring the pressures and impacts, and devising the measures to be able to manage these pressures and impacts. And the report describes 62 guiding principles for adaptation. But there's a big difference between recognising the problem and doing something about it. And the project Clean What Adapt addressed a number of strategic issues and knowledge gaps which were identified in the white paper on adaptation. And this concluded essentially that Although each river basin management plan did include a programme of measures, that was the main purpose of these plans, these measures did not necessarily explicitly refer to adaptation measures to climate change. Additionally, the policy implications of the proposed adaptation strategies which were mentioned for various member states were not always clearly described, and in many cases were actually missing. Further, the Clean What Adapt project also looked at existing EU projects and also went through the literature on climate change impacts and found that in most cases there was very, very little concrete advice on how to adapt for climate change in the future. And these weren't very well specified even where they did exist. And the conclusion was this seemed strange given the evidence which suggested that climate change in its interaction with other stresses was likely to have a major impact on the on freshwater ecosystems across Europe. And finally, a paper by Wilby et al. In 2010 looked at the evidence needed to manage freshwater in changing climate, and this concluded that most policymakers and scientists now accepted that a move towards adaptively managing freshwater species and habitats was long overdue. So that's the rationale behind the Refresh project. And Refresh is concerned with developing a system that will enable the people responsible for managing freshwaters to design restoration programs for freshwater ecosystems that are cost effective and that account for the expected future impacts of climate change and land use change, so that we can meet the compliance with the Water Framework Directive and the Habitats Directives. And at the centre of the project is an evaluation of specific adaptive measures that can be taken at different scales, at the catchment scale and the local scale, to minimise the future impacts of climate change on freshwater quantity, quality and biodiversity. So there are three overlying goals, overarching goals in Refresh. The first one is to increase our understanding of how freshwater ecosystems will actually respond to the environmental changes driven by land use change, climate change, water use demands and pollution over the next 50 to 60 years. Secondly, to translate this knowledge into a way that water managers can use, so that the knowledge can then feed effectively into the design of restoration and management programs and enable us to be ready for the projected future impacts of climate and land use change. And thirdly, to ensure the uptake of Refresh results by target stakeholders, water managers, conservation bodies, policymakers and policy implementers. And that third goal is the one I'm focusing on today. We can generate new information, we can translate this information into usable models, but we need to make sure that this information is then transferred to the people who need to use it. This diagram summarises that. We have the generation of new knowledge on how rivers, lakes and wetlands, the hydrology, chemistry and ecological processes within these systems respond to changes in temperature, precipitation, nutrient loading, driven by climate change, land use change, water resource use change and pollution change. This is the generation of the knowledge required. This is the application of the knowledge to management in terms of mitigating against future change, how we adapt, how we identify which systems are vulnerable, which thresholds are likely to be crossed, which indicators might provide a useful means of monitoring the system, etc. And the key thing in terms of meetings like this is dissemination, how we then transfer new knowledge and the way we apply the new knowledge to people that need to use it. Just briefly, talking about the new knowledge, you'll hear more about this from the presenters that follow, but just some examples here. We have a range of stream and riparian wetland experiments across Europe, which look to assess the impacts of temperature change, the impacts of low flow, flooding and drought, and the combined impacts of these and nutrient loading on the functioning and biodiversity of streams and wetlands. We have a number of lake experiments arrayed across Europe as well, which are looking at the temperature constraints on management success in lakes, the water level and salinity constraints, and the nutrient and organic matter constraints for management success in lakes. As well as these experimental work programs, we have wide-ranging reviews being undertaken across the project, bringing together existing information, analysis of existing data sets, and all this then feeds into the management application. This is a schematic diagram of our modelling approach, where we generate scenarios of future change, climate, land use, water resources, and atmospheric deposition of nitrogen. These feed into catchment models, which are being generated at a number of key sites across Europe here. And these catchment models combine hydrochemical response to these drivers and ecological response. So we're looking at how the ecology responds through the hydrochemical response to these changes in the future. The modelling response looks at how the ecology will change and whether this means the system will be compliant with the Water Framework Directive or the Habitats Directive. If it is still compliant despite these future change, well, that's okay. But if it's not, we can then feed in various measures into the model to try and make sure that we do achieve compliance. And these measures are generated or identified from a number of reviews taking place across the project, but also discussions with stakeholders in the various demonstration catchments. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Once we then feed in the adaptation strategy into the model, if it's still non-compliant, we can go through the circle again and feed another adaptation strategy in. If it is compliant, we then assess whether the measures used to achieve compliance are cost-effective or not. If not, we can again feed another strategy in until we do achieve some degree of compliance with the Water Framework Directive. So that's a very, very brief summary of quite a complicated management system, but just demonstrates how we're hoping to translate our new knowledge into management. So, we've had that one, and that one, and we're now going to move on to dissemination and the uptake of scientific research. And as I have said at a number of meetings up to now, it's clear from discussions at science policy events that have taken place over Europe over the past 3-4 years that there are continuing problems with attempts to establish the practical exchanges between the scientific and the policy-making and implementing communities, particularly regarding disseminating research outputs from European Union funded projects and the transfer of the usable information from these projects to the policy implementers. These projects often are policy driven, therefore we need to make sure that the results are usable. And this is something that I've been trying to do in the final couple of years of the project to make sure that the output from the project does reach the target stakeholders. So there are two broad stakeholder groups in Refresh. One of those is scientists, and scientists are pretty good at disseminating to fellow scientists through the means of peer-reviewed literature. We have the Refresh bibliography here on the Refresh website, and also at international and national conferences. And we collate information about the number of conferences that our scientists attend and disseminate Refresh output at, And this is quite a large number, so I think we're pretty effective in terms of disseminating our results to our fellow scientists. The second group of stakeholders are the managers and policymakers and implementers. And this is what meetings like this is all about, trying to make sure that our message gets across to the people who need to use the information. And to do this, I'm following quite a number of the recommendations coming from a roadmap for uptake of EU water research in policy and industry, following a meeting a couple of years ago. And this essentially asks that we increase communication efforts of EU water research, we improve the accessibility to water research results and speed up the transfer of the results, and we strengthen the science policy interface. And this report is available on the website set out there, and I'm assuming that the presentation will be available on the website at some point subsequently. So how do we do this? Well, our website will, in the final couple of months of the project, we're going to ensure that the results from Refresh are clearly specified in a non-technical way on the website. We will have a section for managers on the website, so managers can go in and see what the main messages are from the project. And we're also looking to ensure that we summarise to some degree the main messages from the project using the languages of the different member states. Because in many cases, those tasked with managing fresh waters don't have the level of English required to go through project websites like this and extract what they need to support their management. So in Refresh, we have generated a number of, and will continue to generate, a number of popular articles for audiences beyond the scientific community. And these are written again in a non-technical way to ensure that the output from the project is accessible to water managers and policy implementers. We have a number of supporting dissemination materials, flyers, PowerPoint presentations, posters, which people from the consortium can use at stakeholder meetings during the project and afterwards as well. We have recently circulated a public newsletter amongst a stakeholder database we have, and this is also available on the Refresh website. There will be more of these between now and the end of the project. Again, these try and summarise what we're doing in a non-technical way. And we've tried to involve stakeholders right from the beginning of the project. This slide relates to a cross-European policy workshop which took place in London in March 2011. And this was attended by policymakers from across Europe, together with some scenario scientists working on scenarios in Refresh, and we had representatives from Turkey at that meeting. A report from this stakeholder workshop considered the potential challenges posed not just by climate and environmental changes, but also by changes taking place in society and also in the political area. And building on these discussions at the workshop, it highlighted research needs and the key responses that might assist in tackling the challenges. But it also focused on how we as scientists needed to communicate with the stakeholders as well. Not just at the beginning, we're involved in discussion with stakeholders throughout the project, and a lot of the focus of this effort is at the case study catchments in Scotland, England, Finland, Norway, Czech Republic and Greece. And there has been a series of workshops in each catchment to discuss the issues with the stakeholders. This is one of the workshops in Scotland, and during the course of the workshops We started off by profiling the catchments, discussing what are they like and what are the main issues with Water Framework Directive compliance, what are the problems faced in the catchments in management terms. We discussed scoping the solutions. What does that mean? Well, that focuses on what management options are currently used and what management options could be used in the future to achieve compliance. And will these management options work in the future if the environment is changing, if the climate is changing, if the land use is changing? There was discussion on the cost effectiveness of these approaches. Are they cost effective and are they proportionate in terms of the benefits? You don't want to spend huge amounts of money for minimal benefit. And also flagging the wider benefits. What are the potential wider ecosystem benefits arising from management measures identified? And these ongoing discussions took place across these demonstration catchments and fed into the design of the modelling part of the programme. And these are the kinds of outputs from the workshop. These are leaflets which are then circulated to stakeholders from the catchment, but also more widely. This is, again, the Scottish catchment. This will have been circulated to stakeholders across Scotland to illustrate the kind of work that we're doing at the catchment scale. And stakeholder engagement at the end as well. There are a number of regional stakeholder workshops planned in Estonia, in Norway, in the UK, and this is the final stakeholder workshop that was planned as part of this programme. And the idea is to disseminate across Europe, directly targeting and involving stakeholders. So we're not looking to talk to scientists in the normal way that we talk to scientists. We're looking to try and get the information from the project that is most useful to stakeholders and then disseminate that to you. This is the Estonian workshop. The main messages from Refresh were discussed at this workshop, and present at the workshop were a selection of Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian and Finnish stakeholders. This followed on from a previous meeting in Estonia, which was focused more on the Estonian stakeholders, and were a range of stakeholders from the Environmental Board, Environment, Agriculture, Social Affairs, and the focus was to advise the Estonian water authorities how to consider climate change impacts in preparing for the revised river basin management plans. Another stakeholder workshop in October took place in Norway. I won't go through this, there's too much here to dwell on, but there were about 40 participants at the workshop, again from a range of different stakeholder organisations. And we presented the Refresh project to the stakeholders. We presented some of the broader things we're looking at, but also focusing in on the work that we were doing in the Norwegian demonstration catchment. There was this meeting in London earlier at the start of last month, Freshwater Management in a Changing World. This took place over 2 days. The first day was a scientific conference, and then the second day we focused more again on getting the message across to stakeholders. And one of the key ways to try and involve the stakeholders at that meeting was to have, for every Refresh presentation, so we had Refresh output from the lakes work we're doing, the streams work, the wetlands work, the modelling and the socio-economic work we're doing. We also had a stakeholder who presented a response. So each of these stakeholders who presented a response was sent the Refresh presentation in advance, and then they were able to then respond to the key recommendations from the project and raise concerns of their own. The presentations from the workshop and also a series of films, film footage of each of these meetings is available on the Refresh website. This is the Refresh website, and if you go to the Refresh news section of the Refresh website, you can download the presentations and also watch the movie. From that meeting, we have had one of the stakeholders prepare this briefing note which summarises the output from the project and highlights the policy implications. This is specifically for Wales, but we're looking to produce these kinds of briefing notes for other countries in the UK, but also beyond. So we have stakeholders from Scotland and England will be preparing something similar, so that the output from the meeting can be circulated not just to those who are there, but for their colleagues across their stakeholder organisations. We have a number of demonstration case studies, as I mentioned before, and these also will be synthesised. The results from these will be synthesised, put on the website, and also leaflets from these will be circulated to stakeholders. We're also considering the policy implications of our work, and we'll be generating a number of policy briefs, not just focusing on policy implementations of the Water Framework Directive and the Habitats Directive, which is our main focus in terms of our policy relevance, but we're also trying to translate the refresh results into the implications for agricultural policy and for energy policy. And this is the kind of output we'll be looking to produce. This is a policy brief which is a plea for zooplankton to be included as one of the elements for assessing the ecological status of lakes. So it highlights what the issues are, why we should consider zooplankton, and some of the scientific literature which supports the evidence for the use of zooplankton in terms of assisting the implementation of the Water Framework Directive. And we'll be producing a number of those to be circulated to policymakers. And the final policy, the final stakeholder event will be taking place on the day before the end of the project at a Science Policy Symposium in Brussels. It's a symposium for freshwater ecology and biodiversity, and we're doing that together with another EU project, BioFresh. And the aim is to bring together policymakers, stakeholders from the water, energy and conservation sector, non-government organisations, the scientific community and other selected experts to discuss what are the challenges in implementing the 2020 biodiversity strategy and the Water Framework Directive. We're hoping to attract policymakers at the EU level and at the national level, various stakeholders from water management, biodiversity, conservation and related policy sectors. And the symposium will involve mixed presentations from different perspectives, the NGO sector, the policymakers and also the scientists. And there'll be a number of roundtable dialogues, so we're looking for direct interaction between the policymakers and the scientists. So, getting towards the end, we're looking for feedback. We have a refresh questionnaire in your delegate packs. Some of these questions may not be directly applicable. A lot of you will not have heard of refresh before, but the main focus here is perhaps on questions 2 and 4. What are the gaps in terms of what scientific research is currently providing to support management of freshwater ecosystems, and what we should do in refresh in the final months of the project to improve the uptake of our results by managers and stakeholders. We don't have time to change the work programme. Any gaps in knowledge or management applications can go forward as recommendations in reports and workshops from the project. But we do have time to try and make sure that the results from the project can be used by the water managers, conservation bodies, policymakers and implementers, and are taken up by the various interest groups. So we do welcome feedback, and if you have any suggestions as to how we might improve our dissemination or how we might reach you, then please include those in the questionnaire. Thank you.
görevler bilgiler için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Acaba sınırı aşan bir tatlı su kaynağı. Tema hakkında Avukat Süleyman Çetin. Vermiş olduğunuz...
Yes, I hear you now.
Ben Süleyman Çetin. Tema hakkında temsilen katılıyorum. Vermiş olduğunuz bilgiler için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Acaba sınırı aşan tatlı su kaynaklarıyla ilgili olarak bu ülkelerde çalışma yaptınız mı? Çünkü bilgisayar değilim. Ya da yapmayı düşünüyor musunuz? Çünkü sınırı aşan sular, özellikle tatlı su kaynakları birden fazla ülkeyi ilgilendirdiği için o ülkelerle ilgili uygulayıcıların veya anlam uygulanan politikaları çok farklı olabilir. Bu konuda varsa çalışmalarınız hakkında bilgi almak isterim. Teşekkür ederim.
We didn't directly study the cross-border problems with freshwaters. We are aware that when you consider the potential impacts on freshwaters, in addition to changes in climate, changes in land use, are the changes in the political environment. But this wasn't an area we looked at because our case study sites tended to be contained within national boundaries, so we didn't consider it a cross-border problem.
Başka sorusu olan? Yok.